She said no, and it broke the entire NBA. Not with a lawsuit, not with a walkout, not with a single angry word. Just one quiet decision from a 22-year-old rookie. And suddenly the most powerful executives in professional basketball had no idea what to do next. If you think that sounds exaggerated, stay with me, because what actually happened behind those closed doors is stranger and more revealing than anything the league's PR machine ever wanted you to see. For months, insiders in sports broadcasting had been buzzing about one single event. Not a playoff series, not a championship, a three-point shootout. League executives, network partners, and marketing teams had quietly built what they believed would become the most watched non-playoff basketball spectacle in television history. The plan was simple on paper. Bring together Stephen Curry, Klay Thompson, Sabrina Ionescu, and the one name that made every advertiser's eyes light up, Caitlin Clark. For elite shooters, one stage, and a number of eyeballs that could rewrite ratings records. And then, almost overnight, the entire plan collapsed. Not because of an injury, not because of a scheduling accident, because Caitlin Clark said no. To understand why that single word hit the league like an earthquake, you have to understand what All-Star Weekend had quietly become in recent years. The truth is uncomfortable. The event was dying a slow death. Ratings had been sliding. Fans were tuning out of exhibition games where nobody plays defense and nothing is really at stake. Networks were pouring billions into broadcast rights while the product they were paying for kept shrinking in relevance. Advertisers were asking hard questions. The casual fan, the person who doesn't track box scores but will stop scrolling for something genuinely compelling, had completely checked out. Executives were desperate for something real. Something that felt like actual competition instead of another manufactured halftime show. And then, almost by accident, they found it. Early in the year, a three-point shootout between Stephen Curry and Sabrina Ionescu became one of those rare sports moments nobody fully predicted and everybody instantly wanted more of. It worked because it couldn't be manufactured. Real skill, real tension, a genuine crossover between the NBA's most beloved shooter and the WNBA's rising star. Viewership spiked. Clips went viral across every platform. Fans who hadn't cared about All-Star content in years were suddenly arguing about it online. For a league desperately searching for a spark, this felt like the blueprint. So the logic inside league headquarters was simple. If one crossover moment could do that much damage to the ratings books, imagine four elite shooters colliding at once. Bring back Curry. Add Klay Thompson for the hometown Bay Area crowd. Keep Ionescu as the proven crossover star. And build the entire spectacle around the one name breaking records since the moment she turned pro, Caitlin Clark. On paper, she was the missing piece that would turn a good event into a historic one. Behind the scenes, locking her in became the single biggest priority in the entire production. This wasn't a polite invitation. This was a full-court press. Network executives, league representatives, marketing teams, all pushing in the same direction at once. The financial incentives on the table were significant. Promotional guarantees that would have put her face on every major advertising platform in the country. Primetime coverage most veterans never get offered. Everything about the package was designed to make saying yes feel automatic. And that's exactly where the people running this negotiation made their first mistake. They were operating off an old playbook. A playbook built for a world where young athletes needed the league far more than the league needed them. A world where the phrase, once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, was supposed to be irresistible. But Caitlin Clark wasn't playing by those old rules. She had already rewritten them before she ever played a single professional minute. And the people sitting across the table from her simply hadn't done their homework. When word leaked that she was turning it down, the reaction inside league offices wasn't disappointment. It was disbelief. The system genuinely wasn't built to process that answer. Veterans who had spent decades in sports media couldn't construct a logical explanation for why a rookie would walk away from the biggest promotional platform available to any athlete in the country. Confusion turned into frustration, and frustration turned into pressure. Phone calls got more urgent. Terms got revisited. New proposals were drafted trying to address whatever objection her camp had raised. And the pressure wasn't subtle. League representatives made it clear they viewed her participation as something close to an obligation. A duty to the sport. A duty to the fans. Declining was quietly framed, in certain circles, as something close to unprofessional. What that framing completely ignored was the reality she was actually living. She had just come off one of the most physically and mentally brutal stretches of any athlete's recent career. No real off-season. Straight from a deep NCAA tournament run into a WNBA rookie season, carrying expectations no first-year player had ever faced before her. Every single game a sellout. Every performance dissected under a national microscope. And on the floor itself, she was absorbing hard fouls and relentless defensive pressure night after night from veterans who were not going easy on the new girl just because the cameras were rolling. She was exhausted in ways that don't show up in a highlight reel or a spreadsheet. And the last thing a genuinely exhausted athlete wants is to fly across the country to serve as a ratings rescue mission for an event that had nothing to do with her own competitive goals. The fallout spilled out of the executive suites and into open national conversation almost immediately. What followed wasn't a small story about a shooting contest falling apart. It became a much bigger conversation about power, respect, and how the NBA actually views its relationship with the WNBA. Some commentators argued the league had mishandled the entire negotiation from the very beginning, treating her primarily as a commercial draw rather than a serious competitor with her own priorities. Others pointed out the quiet condescension in assuming she would naturally put the NBA's promotional calendar ahead of her own body and her own season. Suddenly, people who had barely paid attention to women's basketball were fully invested in the politics of how this negotiation had been handled. Every attempt by league representatives to downplay the situation only poured more fuel on it. To really understand why this moment landed so hard, you need the full picture of what her rookie year had already looked like. Her presence in the league hadn't just been a boost, it had been genuinely transformative, and that kind of impact never arrives without friction. Sellout crowds followed her to every arena. Charter flights players had been fighting for years, suddenly appeared almost overnight. Broadcast deals that would have sounded impossible 18 months earlier were signed and celebrated. By any measurable standard, she was the most impactful rookie the league had ever seen. But that level of impact creates visible tension among veterans who had spent years grinding for recognition the entire league had been fighting for collectively. Hard fouls became a running storyline. Subtle shade in post-game press conferences became a running storyline. Lukewarm praise from established stars, even as the numbers told a completely different story, became a running storyline. She was simultaneously being celebrated as the face of a movement and quietly tested by parts of her own league in a way that would have been a lot for any rookie to navigate. Now picture the optics if she had skipped her own league's priorities to fly across the country and headline the NBA's showcase instead. Her critics would have had exactly the ammunition they were looking for. So stepping back from the whole circus wasn't only about physical recovery. It was about protecting her position inside a league that was still figuring out how to coexist with the phenomenon she had become. And then there's the number that reframes this entire story. Her rookie contract with the Indiana Fever paid her roughly $76,000 for the season. That is not a typo. While she was personally responsible for generating hundreds of millions of dollars across ticket sales, broadcast deals, and merchandise, her actual league salary barely registered as a rounding error in a serious corporate budget. But that number only tells half the story. Her endorsement portfolio entering the professional ranks was unlike anything a women's basketball player had ever assembled. Major athletic and consumer brands, worth tens of millions of dollars combined, all built on authentic fan loyalty she had earned long before turning pro. She didn't need the NBA's promotional machine to reach a mass audience. She was already there. This is exactly what the executives pressuring her team failed to understand. Traditional leverage only works when the athlete actually needs what the league controls: exposure, platform, visibility, reach. When someone arrives with an independent audience of millions and endorsement deals that dwarf anything the league salary structure could ever offer, those old levers simply stop working. The negotiating team was playing a game designed for a world where they held every card. In the world she had already built for herself, they were holding a hand that was mostly worthless. The league needed her far more than she needed the league, and her decision said that louder than any press release ever could. Behind closed doors, the panic was real. Advertising packages for the showcase had been sold based on projections that assumed her presence. Media buyers had allocated budgets around a four-way crossover that no longer existed. When those projections turned into fiction, some very uncomfortable conversations started happening between league representatives and their broadcast partners. Sports talk shows ran the story on a loop for weeks. Had the league overplayed its hand? Was this a permanent rift forming? The sheer volume of coverage became part of the story itself, proof that one person's decision not to show up for a single exhibition event could dominate the national sports conversation for weeks straight. And while the league was managing its own crisis, something else was quietly happening in the background. A newer 3-on-3 women's league had entered the picture with an offer structure that looked nothing like traditional basketball economics. Equity stakes, real salary guarantees for months that used to be a financial dead zone for women players. Genuine creative input into how the product gets built and marketed. For the first time, elite female talent had real alternatives that didn't require accepting whatever terms the established league decided to offer. The failure to secure her participation wasn't happening in a vacuum. It was happening in a market where her leverage was multiplying every single month. While the immediate headlines focused on the standoff itself, something bigger was happening that most coverage completely missed. Other players were watching, not just in the WNBA, but across professional sports as a whole. A rookie had looked the most powerful basketball organization in the country directly in the eye, declined its biggest offer, and faced zero negative consequences. Her brand didn't drop. Her fan base didn't shrink. Her sponsors didn't get nervous. If anything, the authenticity of choosing herself over corporate pressure made her more valuable to the brands already invested in her. And that lesson travels fast through locker rooms. The old model, defer to league authority in exchange for platform access, suddenly looked outdated to an entire generation of athletes watching a completely different path play out in real time. Build direct relationships with fans through honest competition. Build commercial partnerships that don't need anyone's approval. Treat your own career and your own body as non-negotiable instead of something to sacrifice for someone else's event calendar. The ripple effect of one decision not to show up for a Sunday night shootout ended up reshaping how a whole generation of athletes thinks about their own power. And here's the irony that every analyst kept circling back to no matter which angle they were covering. For years, the standard story about women's basketball was that it needed the NBA's visibility and resources to break through to casual fans. Women's sports were treated as existing in a dependent relationship, relying on proximity to the men's game to reach audiences that weren't already believers. What this entire standoff exposed was that the story had quietly flipped and nobody had officially announced it. The league wasn't offering her a platform out of generosity. It was chasing her star power to rescue a format that had lost the ability to generate excitement on its own. The organization that women's basketball supposedly needed for credibility was the one making emergency calls and rewriting proposals trying to win over a second-year professional. The so-called secondary product had produced the star the primary league was desperate to build its own showcase around. When the final lineup for All-Star Weekend was confirmed without her name attached, the conversation shifted to what this actually meant going forward. And even league executives, once they got past the initial damage control, had to grudgingly admit the old approach simply doesn't work anymore. Future crossover events would need a completely different foundation. Workload and recovery couldn't be dismissed as an inconvenient obstacle. Real financial participation for the athletes generating the actual value would have to be part of the conversation. The gap between a grueling season and requests for extra promotional appearances would need to account for human limits, not just broadcast calendars. Respect for an athlete's own stated priorities would have to replace the old assumption that enough money and prestige could override any personal decision. None of these are radical demands. They're basic professional courtesies the sports industry simply never had to extend to women athletes before because the leverage to demand them didn't exist. That changed permanently the moment she said no. What she pulled off in that stretch wasn't just smart personal career management. It was structurally significant in a way that will keep echoing through professional sports for years. She proved that in a media environment where fans follow individual personalities across platforms with a loyalty legacy organizations simply cannot manufacture, the old institutional levers of power have a ceiling. You cannot pressure someone into compliance when they don't actually need what you're offering. You cannot manufacture urgency around a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for someone who is already living the life that opportunity was supposed to unlock. And you can no longer pretend women's sports exist as a supporting feature inside someone else's content ecosystem when the numbers tell a completely different story every single night. She understood her own value with a clarity that caught an entire industry off guard. She was playing the long game while the people across the table were chasing a single Sunday night rating spike. She protected her body, her focus, and her career trajectory when the pressure to sacrifice all three was coming from every direction at once. And in doing that, she drew a line the entire professional sports landscape is still trying to figure out how to deal with. The balance of power didn't shift gradually or politely. It shifted all at once, marked by the silence of one name missing from an event roster and the deafening national conversation that silence created. The era of dictating terms to elite athletes based on who used to hold the power is over. The only real question left is how fast the organizations built entirely around that old dynamic can adapt to a world that has already moved on without them.